bringing national topics that matter to Oklahoma. With Congressman Tom Cole. This is Cole on Congress.
Thank you for joining us today for another episode of Cole on Congress. And today I'm really pleased to introduce a great friend of mine and a rising star in Congress, the Congressman from Texas's 23rd District, Will Hurd. Will's an extraordinary guy, great member of Congress, relatively new member of the Intelligence Committee, and with a pretty amazing background as an undercover agent for the Central Intelligence Agency before he came to Congress. So he's a guy we all look to for a lot of on-the-ground expertise. He also has the longest stretch of border in the South or anywhere in the country, I assume. Nobody else could possibly have more than 873 miles or whatever it is. But it's just really good to have you here.
Well, thanks for having me on. I've been trying to get on for 3.5 years.
Oh, yeah, right.
And I'm finally here. So this is a milestone.
Believe me, this isn't going to be the highlight of your congressional career. But I do want to tell our audience, first time I met you, actually, you were running for Congress the very first time, and I think I was the the chairman of the NRCC. That was a tough district for us. It wasn't a Republican. You had a primary, and it didn't work out the way you wanted it to work out. And most times people quit. I mean, they don't come back and do it again. You did, and you're on a great career. But before we talk about that, I want you to tell us a little bit about your background, because it's so unique in Congress.
Well, Tom, as you know, I grew up in San Antonio, Texas, born and raised. My folks still live there in the house I was born into. And when I left San Antonio, I went to Texas A&M University, and I was studying computer science. And it was my freshman year in college, and I'm walking across campus, and I see a sign that says, "Take 2 journalism classes for $425 in Mexico City." And I had $450 in my bank account. So I went to Mexico and fell in love being in another culture, thought it was cool, seeing things I only read about in books, and I added international studies as a minor. So my sophomore year, the first class I took in international studies, I had a guest lecturer who was this former CIA tough guy. He was old school, Cold Warrior, told the most amazing stories. And after that class, I did something I had never done at that point in my college career. I went to a professor's office and knocked on the door and said, "Tell me more." And that began my interest in the CIA. And so when I graduated from A&M at 22, I went into the agency. I was a case officer. So I was the dude in the back alleys at 4 o'clock in the morning collecting intelligence on threats to our homeland. And I always said I did 2 years at the super secret CIA training facility called The Farm. And now it's on Google Maps. I wish that was a joke. I then did 2 years in India, 2 years in Pakistan, 2 years in New York City doing a lot of interagency work, and then 1.5 years in Afghanistan, where I managed all of our undercover operations. Best job on the planet.
Were you in Kabul? Or?
I was primarily in Kabul. I've spent some time down in Bagram, which is where most of our military operations are started. But it was a great experience that really informed me, and it's helping me in Congress. Not only on, I've chased terrorists all across the world. I've chased Russian intelligence officers. We went after Iranian nuclear weapons proliferators, dealt with the North Koreans. So dealing with that topic, but also, I had to learn how to look behind me and make sure nobody was following me and conduct surveillance, and that's come in handy in Congress. But it was a great experience, and I ran. Because I also had to brief members of Congress, and unfortunately, I didn't meet guys like you, Tom, when I was still in the CIA. Because if I would have met guys like you, or Mac Thornberry, our chairman of House Armed Services, or Elise Stefanik, I would have stayed in, because I would have been like, we have some great people running our country, but I was pretty shocked by some of the folks I was having to brief. And my mama said, "You're the part of the problem, part of the solution." And so I left Afghanistan, moved back to San Antonio, ran for Congress, and lost. I don't tell that story anymore.
No, it's okay. Let me tell you a funny story just quickly. I want to get on about this, but I had a friend I went to graduate school with named Matthew Paris, and he was at Yale on a what's called a Clare Fellowship, English.
Okay.
His job when he got back was to join the British Foreign Service. And he was tasked with briefing members of Parliament.
Okay.
And he had precisely the same experience you did. He said, boy, these guys are that dumb. I mean, I too could be a member of Parliament. And ended up working for Margaret Thatcher as her private parliamentary secretary, and then 3 years later as a member of the House of Parliament, and stayed in the House of Commons a number of years, good career, and now a major journalist. But yeah, sometimes exposure to members does not exactly elevate your opinion of the institution.
It doesn't, but also we need people that have an expertise in these issues, right? And so, I spent a lot of time talking about cybersecurity. I spent a lot of time talking about national security, and when I lost that first race, gave me an opportunity to be a partner in a consulting firm, helped start a cybersecurity company, where we basically broke into banks, stole their money, and show them how we did it. Right? And what's scary is we always got in, right? And so that's an expertise that I try to rely on. The experience that you have on appropriations and understanding how our government actually works. We need more people that have that expertise in a particular area in order for us to understand those unintended consequences of some of the decisions that we're going to make. And so I try to narrow my focus on those areas where I have some experience, and I think that has allowed me to be a much better legislator.
Let me ask you quickly about Afghanistan, since you spent so much time there and in such a sensitive position. We all always hear the headline, America's longest war. Yeah. I've actually been pretty impressed with the president, who came into office with one opinion and frankly, I think listened to his military advisors and changed it, that we need to be there since this is where 9/11 happened from, and we maybe don't need 30 to 100,000 troops on the ground. But we have to have a presence, and we're a stabilizing force. So that's a pretty knotty problem for all of us. How would you say, how are we doing? What are the things we ought to be doing going forward to try and make sure we don't have that as sort of a terrorist safe haven in the way that it was pre-9/11?
So let me give some context before I
Sure.
answer that question. On September 11th, I was in a training course near Washington, D.C. On September 12th, I was the 4th employee of a unit called CTCSO, the Counterterrorism Center Special Operations Division. It was headed by a gentleman named Hank Crumpton, and we were the entity that ultimately prosecuted the war in Afghanistan. And if you would have told me on September 12th that it would be another 17 years before another major attack on our homeland, I would have said you were crazy at that time.
Totally agree.
And the reason it hasn't is because the men and women in our military, intelligence corps, diplomatic corps, which we oftentimes forget, and of course law enforcement. But in December, late December of 2001, when Kandahar fell, Kandahar was the capital of the Taliban in southern Afghanistan. When that fell, there were only 400 Americans on the ground in Afghanistan. 300 Special Forces, 100 CIA. Now, we also had the greatest Air Force the world had ever seen, but when you talk to Afghans about the invasion of Afghanistan, they're like, what invasion? So we were able to kick out the entire Taliban out of the country, kill 75% of al-Qaeda leadership with 400 people on the ground. So that's the example and the model. So we can help the Afghanistan get under control with a small footprint. So where are we today? I think we have made some mistakes there. When you look at the number of counties, or excuse me, provinces, they're like our counties, that are contested by the Taliban, it's higher than it was when I left Afghanistan in 2009. That's really unfortunate. The problem is a political problem in having a stable government in Afghanistan. The Afghans are great fighters. The Taliban is not that sophisticated, but we also have to change the calculation to make the Taliban realize we're going to be there and that we're going to help Afghanistan no matter what, because we cannot allow terrorists to have a place where they can train, equip, and come out to us. Because we haven't talked about al-Qaeda that much in the last few years. Al-Qaeda is still a thing It's metastasized, it's grown into Africa, and they still have the same goal of trying to hit our homeland. So we have to be prepared. And I'll say this, there are a million, I'll say two things. There's 1 million girls right now in Afghanistan in school. That wasn't happening 17 years ago. That is what's going to ultimately change that country. When half of the population wasn't going to school or allowed to work, you have problems. But this is something that we're going to see real change. And for us as Americans, it's sometimes hard to understand that culture. And I remember I would meet with a guy who was one of the original Mujahideen. These were the folks that fought the Russians back in the 80s. And he would always say, I would sneak into his compound and he would sometimes just stare at me or tell me a story. And one time he said, Mr. Willie, they always call me Willie over there. Mr. Willie, I've been a Pakistani for 50 years. Pakistan as a country is a relatively young country. I've been a Muslim for 1,420 years, but I've been a Pashtun for 3,333 years. That's the ethno-linguistic group that's there. And it's hard for us to know how thousands of years of history and culture has an impact on people, but it does. And we have to do a better job, even after 17 years, of understanding the culture so that we know how to help the Afghans keep and hold their country.
Well, again, it's an amazing service that you've rendered, and I always try to tell people, Congress is like that. Everybody has the same vote, but everybody has a different background and expertise. So, you talking about, war, you listen to Sam Johnson and guys like Steve Russell because they fought them and been incredibly brave in the field. Has that clearly view. You talk about something like this, counterterrorism, and how we deal with counterinsurgency operations. You're like the congressional expert because you got real life experience and real life credibility, and it gives you a role as a second term member that really puts you in a position to influence people that are more senior and drive the debate. I mean, it's a remarkable contribution that honestly I think you're making to the country. You mentioned obviously the security background, and I want to talk to you a little bit about the range of threats we face now. You're on the Intelligence Committee. You're a congressionally recognized, nationally recognized expert in cybersecurity. People hear that and their eyes glaze over, but they get scared. So what are, where are we in terms of dealing with the kind of cyber threats we get from peer powers like China or rogue states like in Iran or North Korea? And what should we do? And obviously the Russians. What should we be doing?
So we have to realize what is actually happening. We're becoming an increasingly interconnected world. And that's ultimately a good thing. But with more interconnections, that means there's more things to attack. You look at, a lot of people say the Internet of Things. The fact that your refrigerator can talk to your car and tell you to stop and pick up milk because you don't have any. I think that's a great thing, and it's going to help with making our lives easier. But there comes additional risk where now if I hack into your refrigerator, I could potentially get access to your car. So that's what we have to remember. Now, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, they are very sophisticated. Their capabilities are close to us, the UK, Australia, Israel, all of our allies. And we have to make sure that we're defending against that. But what is a cyber act of war? If North Korea launched a missile into San Francisco, we know how we would respond. The North Koreans know how we would respond, which is one of the reasons why the North Koreans don't do it. Right? So when it comes to deterrence, if we haven't established what is an act of war, then you haven't established what the response should be to something. And if there's not a consequence to negative behavior, that negative behavior is going to continue. So not every country has, hacking into someone's information is a criminal offense. So if you want to have the ultimate consequence, arresting someone, putting someone in jail, you got to make sure this is against the law in all rule and law-abiding places around the country. So that's one basic thing that we have to do. Two, the defending digital infrastructure is hard, but if you do some basic things, like make sure your software is patched, make sure you have a 14 character password, and don't click on links from people you don't know, you're going to protect yourself from about 85, 90% of those threats. But this is a way, it's cheap, and so you don't have to be the Russian SVR to take advantage of something. You can be a terrorist that has a laptop to get access. So we have to harden our digital infrastructure. We have to, the private sector and the public sector have to work together, and we have to start thinking about what's a digital act of war, how do we attribute an attack? Do we have to attribute to, Colonel Igor who did this attack, or just saying it's enough for the Russian government? These are some of the questions that we need to be able to answer.
Are we going about that in any kind of systematic way that gives you confidence that we're getting on top of this kind of challenge?
This conversation starts at the National Security Council, and I know H.R. McMaster's has been leading that. You have these conversations within every branch of the military, and then more importantly, you have the Department of Homeland Security, which is responsible for defending the government outside of the military and the intelligence branch, and coordinate with the private sector and the rest of society. And DHS is playing an increased role in getting better. DHS is supposed to respond and help the utility sector. So what happens when the Russians try to turn our lights off? What happens if they try to stop our water? These are attacks that are real, because the Russians have done that. They did in the Ukraine a couple of years ago. So we have to be prepared. How do you, they're going to try to manipulate our elections in 2018. How do you make sure you're working with the 10,000 different election administrations across the country to make sure they're hardening their defenses and are prepared? So I think DHS is up for the task, and they play an increasingly important role.
Well, you're sort of our congressional acknowledged expert on counterinsurgency and undercover work. You clearly know the cybersecurity realm. But in addition to that, you do have the longest border with Mexico of any congressional district. And you've been, I think, I've had the opportunity to hear you in Rules Committee when you come up and talk about these things. I don't have the privilege of serving on one of your committees, but I think you're always incredibly thoughtful because we have all kinds of discussion, and I'm not trying to get political about wall, no wall. But in your opinion, given your security background, given the fact that you live in a border area, how should we approach what I know every American, no matter where they are on the political spectrum, wants to achieve? We want to have secure borders. We don't want people coming here that we don't want to be here. At the same time, we want to be a welcoming and friendly place. We've got a good neighbor in Mexico. They're not an enemy. They're a friend. So how do we hit the right balance? What are the things we ought to be doing that we haven't been able to achieve?
Sure. So I represent from San Antonio to El Paso, 29 counties, 2 time zones, 825 miles of the border. It is larger than 26 states and roughly the size of Georgia.
Wow.
And more border than anybody, as you explained. So we do not have operational control of our border. And what is operational control? We don't know everything that's coming across our border and can say where that thing went. That's a problem. But the way you solve this is not building a 30-foot high concrete structure from sea to shining sea. You solve this problem by utilizing technology to extend your most important resource, the human capital, the men and women in Border Patrol. The technology exists today where we can determine the difference between a bunny rabbit and a person. We can track that. We can deploy a small drone to track that individual until we're able to deploy our men and women in Border Patrol. 80% of that can be done with artificial intelligence, machine learning, and it's a fraction of the costs. And so most people think that we have the best technology already deployed along the border. We don't. Most of the technology we have along the border is 20 years old. Imagine that. Does anybody have a TV that's 20 years old in their home? Probably not.
Well, I probably do, but not anybody else.
But that 20-year-old TV was probably a really good TV.
It's a really good television, no question
about
about it. I'm a really cheap Republican.
So we got to get the best technology. And I'll give an example. El Paso sector, the border is broken up into sectors. El Paso sector has about 300 miles of the border. Only 60 has persistent technology along it. That's a problem, right? And so this smart wall, as I like to describe it, is a fraction of the cost. It's more efficient, and it's going to allow us to do things like should you be following, if people are bringing drugs into the country, should you try to follow it to see where the distribution networks are in the rest of the country? In some cases you should, in some cases you should grab them. If we have the technology and then we're comfortable that we can chase this and understand where these transshipment points are, that'll be a good thing. The narcos in Mexico, just Mexico, are making over $60 billion a year in the United States of America. Wow. And correct me if I'm wrong, Tom, the U.S. intelligence budget is roughly $60 billion a year.
I could tell you, but that'd be classified.
and look, the narco traficantes, the kingpin human smugglers, they don't have battles in Congress, and they're not getting funded month to month, right? And so they're at a disadvantage. We also need to be working with our friends in Mexico on stopping it before it actually gets to our border. Homeland Security investigations are doing more overseas and in South and Central America, but I think what we do now, we should be able to understand all 2,000 miles of our southern border, and the only way we're going to do that is by the additional use of technology. And that's why I'm glad in these recent appropriations we just passed had a lot more technology for the men and women in Border Patrol. Oh, and by the way, all those sensors, all that stuff we're collecting, we should be beaming it to that individual Border Patrol agent on a smartphone that they have attached to their arm. Right now, in a lot of places, their cell phones don't work. Their push-to-talk radios don't work. And so they're pursuing dangerous people, many people, with zero information of knowing what's over the horizon. That's a problem, and it's a problem we can solve pretty quickly.
Well, the debate has gotten, as you know, so politicized that we've got symbolic discussions of this, that. I think what most Americans want is just security, okay? Mm-hmm. We want to have something that we have a high degree of confidence works, what kind of progress have we been able to make given how the charges that get hurled back and forth in a partisan sense?
I think it starts with, what are we going to monitor as being successful? The tool that's used, whether it's technology or concrete structure, that's a tool. We shouldn't be monitoring that. We should be monitoring, are there less drugs coming into our country? Is there less illegal immigration coming into our country? Are we stopping this problem before it gets to us? That's where we should be looking at, how do we keep a good scorecard? But we have done better. Our intelligence services are focusing on the issue of drug smuggling and kingpin human smugglers. They're working with more liaison services. Those are people that we work with in other countries. We're seeing an increase in the people we're grabbing. We're seeing a decrease in the people that are coming here illegally. So there are some positive steps that are being made, but we have a long way to go. And I would agree with you, Tom, and as I crisscross my district and other places around this country, people just want to see us solve the problem. And I think we can, and I think we can do it in a very short period of time if we're using the right technology and have the right tactics, techniques, and procedures in place.
Well, you've actually been one of the few that has managed to work in a bipartisan sense on this. I know you have legislation. Mm-hmm. That you've worked with our Democratic colleagues on, because again, I see this as an American problem. It shouldn't be the partisan divide that it's become. We should all be for secure borders. So, look, you've operated here now you're in your second term. You've seen the divisions. How comfortable are you that Congress, working as you have with your colleagues, quite honestly, can overcome this? And the other thing that you've always stressed is how important it is to listen to the people that are actually doing the job, the men and women on the Border Patrol. I remember asking you what you do, and she said, well, let's go down and listen to each people. They actually know in their sector what works. In some places it might be a wall. In some places it's electronic security in depth, and some it's additional people, whatever. And we should have a pretty, diverse system. I mean, again, not using the same thing in every particular area. So you've been around here. Do you think that's possible to achieve that kind of bipartisan consensus and then implement it?
I think it absolutely is possible. And I think when you start with listening to people that are doing the job, when I was in the CIA, it was always a tension between headquarters and the field. You're out there getting shot at, you're the one doing 20 hours a day, and you have headquarters come in and tell you to do something that's ridiculous because they've never been on the ground. And so that's something that has stuck with me, and I try not to be that guy up here, and so I want to listen. I want to have a bias towards the people that are actually working. And I would say this, like, as I've crisscrossed my district, I've learned way more unites us than divides us. And oftentimes when we're up here, we focus on that 20% that divides us rather than the 80% that we agree on. And I also think most folks want us to disagree without being disagreeable. The competition of ideas is what made this experiment called America work. And when we engage in that and we end up coming out with something that is supported by both sides, that's the kind of stuff that usually sticks. And we have plenty of examples in our past, and why I think this uber partisan environment in which we're in now, I think most people, R's, D's, independents, really want us to solve problems and work together. So I think our best days are ahead of us. And oftentimes when I walk through the Capitol, I always stop and remind myself that this building, Congress, this institution, for 240 years has been a beacon of hope, a beacon of light. It has exported democracy to so many parts of the world. We have been what's responsible for 70 years of peace and prosperity in Europe that has allowed to economic expansion for everyone. We all did that, and we can get back to that day. And I hope at one point in the future, when a little kid is 7 or 8 years old and you're asking them, what do you want to be when you grow up? And they're going to say, I want to be a fireman, I want to be an astronaut, I want to be a doctor, I want to be a member of Congress. I think we can get to that point, but it requires us to be examples for our community.
Well, we don't have a lot of time left, but I do want to quickly, I mean, you've been able to do that. Look, you're African-American that represents an Hispanic district. Mm-hmm. You're Republican that represents an historically Democratic district. You travel back to Washington, D.C. in a car for what, 20, I don't know, 2 days?
Hours.
Yeah, whatever it was, with one of our Democratic colleagues who's now actively engaged in another race, and you guys are talking, and it was such a new and refreshing way to think. And the reaction was, boy, why can't Congress do like that? So last question in 30 seconds, what are you going to do next?
Well, get reelected in 2018 is step one, but I want to focus on policies that help keep this country safe and make sure that we continue to be this beacon of light for the rest of the world.
Well, I got to tell you, it is so refreshing to talk to you. It's so refreshing to watch you in Congress and watch you pull together and create unusual coalitions that focus on real life problems and actually get stuff done. I'm just extraordinarily proud of you, and it's wonderful to be your colleague, and I'm looking for great things in the future.
Well, you're too kind, and I'm glad I have mentors and examples to look up to like you, Tom. You really have been an amazing colleague and a friend, and I'm looking forward to continuing serving side by side with you.
Well, great. Time went pretty fast, so thanks a lot. Now we just stand here for a while and look at one another while they wrap up.
There we go. There we go. That was quick.
It was quick.